Good afternoon, good evening, and actually I see we have some people from China, Australia, et cetera, sign in, so good morning to all of you. I'm Noor Kokiar, I'm the Executive Director of the Washington State China Relations Council. I'd like to welcome you to today's event, which is co-sponsored by the Seattle-Shanghai Expats Society. We are very pleased today to have Cheng with us, and he's going to discuss his key insights from his book, Middle Class Shanghai. Before we start, let me briefly introduce the Washington State China Relations Council. Our organization is the oldest state-level entity promoting bilateral commercial, educational, and cultural exchanges with China. The council provides thought-provoking webinars and other events, as well as providing information and policy suggestions to our government and business leaders. We also have a sister organization, which is called the Washington State China Relations Fund, which is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Its mission is to support our educational programs and also our local community efforts. And before I introduce our speaker and our moderator, let me just tell you about our next major event. On December 9, the council will co-sponsor a conference with the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai, titled The New China Landscape for American Business. The half-day virtual event will feature several well-known China experts, as well as the China-based CEOs of a number of American companies. Panels will discuss the broad outlook for U.S.-China relations, the operating environment for American companies in China, and also for the outlook for U.S.-China tech, both collaboration and investment. We're quite looking forward to this event. If you want to know more, please take a look at our webinar, www.wscrc.org. And now let me introduce today's speaker and moderator. Our speaker today is Cheng Li, the director of the John L. Thornton China Center and senior fellow in Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institute. He is also director of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. Li focuses on the transformation of political leaders, generational change, the Chinese middle class, and technological development in China. Li grew up in Shanghai during the Cultural Revolution. In 1985, he came to the States where he received his master's in Asian Studies from the University of California at Berkeley, and then he finished his doctorate in political science at Princeton. From 1993 to 95, he worked in China as a fellow sponsored by the Institute of Current World Affairs in the US, observing grassroots changes in his native country. Based on this experience, he published a nationally acclaimed book titled Rediscovering China, Dynamics and the Dilemma of Reform. Li is the author of numerous other books and articles, too many for me to name here. So please take a look at the announcement about about today's event or our website to see more of what he's written. Our moderator today is Amy Summers, who spent 3 decades as a China-focused lawyer, including 11 years working in Shanghai as a partner in an international law firm. Amy's also an author whose historical thriller, Rumors from Shanghai, was just recently released. She's also written nonfiction pieces such as op-eds and articles on residential real property rights in Shanghai during the Cultural Revolution, and a reference book on foreign investment and real property law in China. Amy is also a member of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, and she's on the advisory committee of the recently established Vancouver Anti-Corruption Institute. And from 2012 to 16, she served on the board of directors of the anti-corruption nonprofit Trace International. She's held a number of leadership roles in the American Bar Association section of international law and is a fellow of the American Bar Association. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce the founder of the Seattle-Shanghai Expat Society, who's our co-sponsor today, Shindy Zhou. Shindy?
Hey, thank you, Noor. Let me briefly introduce you on the Seattle-Shanghai Expat Society. I started this group actually literally 4 years ago, and not shortly after I moved from Shanghai to Seattle. My initial intent is to bring together people in this region with the shared connections with Shanghai. And prior to the pandemic, we held quite lively monthly sessions to discuss issues with common interest. I really look forward that we can resume our in-person meeting soon. But if any of you, if you want to involved in our group, if you are happen to be in Shanghai and loosely connected to, happen to be Seattle and loosely connected to Shanghai, and please check our website. Before we hear Cheng Li to talk about Shanghai, I would like to make some housekeeping notes. First, please keep yourself on mute all through this discussion. In later of this session, we arranged about 20 minutes also audience Q&A. So if you have questions along the way, please type in the chat box. With that, I'm going to turn over to Amy. Amy, please.
Thank you so much. Shanghai is my adopted hometown that I love so much. So it's really an honor to get to talk to somebody who is so knowledgeable about it and who has written with such amazing nuance about so many aspects of Shanghai. And in talking today, what I'd like to do, because a lot of Cheng Li's book is about what to look for in the future, what we see today and how it portends to what will happen in the future. And so I'd like to first go to the past and ask a little bit about what happened in the past and how we got to where we are today, and then talk a little bit about where we are today and how Cheng Li sees it and sees Shanghai's role, and then talk about his ideas for the future. And you can put questions in the chat that we'll be getting to as we go along. So to kick things off, I would say that my perception is conventional thinking, Cheng, is that Shanghai isn't really part of China. It's its own thing. You can't really make generalizations based on Shanghai, and it's sui generis. And yet you place Shanghai as central to understanding what has happened in the last 40 years and also what is going to happen in the coming decades in different possible scenarios. So could you talk a little bit about why you see Shanghai as actually part of real China?
Okay, great. First of all, I noticed that Nor called me Li, Amy called me Cheng, and Cindy called me Cheng Li. So it's really confusing what's my first name, what's my last name. Actually, for those of you who speak Chinese, my name is the combination of last name of Jackie Chen and Jet Li. When I was a college professor, I also told my students my Kung Fu skill is also a combination of these two. Li Lianjie de Li, Cheng Long de Cheng. Well, anyway, and thank you so much for the invitation, and Nor for your very generous introduction, and also for your great work of your organization. I'm honored to speak to your distinguished audience, and particularly delighted to have a conversation with Amy, an accomplished author, China-focused lawyer, and fellow Shanghainese. Now, before answering your question, Amy, I would like to convey how thrilled I am, even only virtually, to see Cindy and some other members of the Seattle-Shanghai Expat Society. Ernest Hemingway once wrote that, I quote, "If we are lucky enough to have lived in Paris as a young man, then wherever you go for the rest of your life, it stays with you, for Paris is a movable feast." End quote. My life has also been a movable feast, although my feast began in a city known in some quarters as the Paris of the East. I'm sure you have a similar emotional attachment to Shanghai as well. For some of you have the strong ties with Shanghai. Now, as Nor mentioned, I was born and raised in Shanghai. In that city, I experienced both the dark era of Red Terror during the Cultural Revolution as a young boy, and also happier and more promising time of Deng Xiaoping's economic reform and opening up in the early 1980s as a college student. So Shanghai remains close to my heart. Now, to answer your question, Amy, Shanghai is distinctive, or perhaps even unique city because of its well-deserved title as the most westernized Chinese city, and its strong indigenous local culture that always maintains its own identity. But I disagree with the notion that the Shanghai is not a part of the real China. My book shows that Shanghai has always remained an inherently Chinese city. Shanghai was always China's Shanghai, and it never lost its cultural identity or feeling of Chineseness. Now, I want to highlight 3 points. First, Shanghai has multiple identities: local, national, and cosmopolitan. Second, the fact that China has a Shanghai reveals Shanghai's contribution to the diversity of the country. And the third, Shanghai is a key to modern China. I remember there's one Westerner wrote a book, I think Mr. Murphy, the title is Shanghai is Key to Modern China. Now, Shanghai has served as a window or gate to the outside world, or bridge between East and West, as Amy just said. It was Shanghai that introduced the world to China, and it was also Shanghai that brought China into the world, both during the Republican period and also Reform era. Now, as we know, that Shanghai was also the birthplace of the Chinese Communist Party and the center of Maoist radicalism in the Cultural Revolution, a lot of violence in the city. Now, in a sense, understanding Shanghai is vital to understanding modern China. A Chinese saying, which I use in my book, is particularly illustrative here. Now, I quoted a saying here: to learn about the 2,000-year Chinese history, one should visit Xi'an. To understand the 500-year Middle Kingdom, one has to go to Beijing. To grasp the past 100 years of changes in China, one must look at Shanghai. Over to you, Amy.
All right, you will not get argument from me about Shanghai being, real and central, but I have been troubled in the last few years because it's become quite popular among a certain strand of American China watchers to look back at the events of the last 40 years and make some variation of the argument that US engagement with China has failed. And the reason it has failed is because China never intended to engage in good faith internationally. And it's all been a big lie. And that's why things are as they are, because they're no longer hiding. And it was predestined that we would be where we are today. Could you talk a little bit about your view of that argument and whether you see it as a legitimate characterization of where things started and where they've ended up in the last 4 decades?
Well, I certainly disagree with this awfully simplistic argument or simplistic view. Shanghai is a showcase of what I call the two tails of a city. Yes, as the so-called head of dragon, we heard that term for a long time. Shanghai has reflected China's industrial policy, maybe even you can say also state capitalism. But we should not forget that Shanghai has been the frontier city of the market reform, opening up, and the cosmopolitanism. The first stock market was established in Shanghai, and there's a lot of firsts during the reform period. Now, Shanghai was and is and will be deeply integrated into the international system. For example, Shanghai is now the world's busiest container port, and Singapore is the second. I remember when I said to C.H. Tong, the former the chief executive of Hong Kong 10 years ago, he originally from Ningbo, also a Shanghainese. I said Shanghai will surpass Singapore. He has some doubt, but Shanghai actually 7 or 8 years ago surpassed Singapore, become the busiest city in container port in the world. Now, critics of Shanghai and China may reasonably argue that Shanghai is a showcase of China's growing aggressive global outreach. Now, this is inherited the statement you quote. But it's also true that Shanghai represents the vanguard of the world-class worldly voices, views, and values. Now, my book has 2 long chapters really about the city's avant-garde scenes and activities by these Shanghai avant-garde artists, including their fascinating works, demonstrating these cosmopolitan voices, views, and values. Now, my point here is that Shanghai and China should not be perceived in a monolithic and stagnant way. The internal contradiction and the paradoxical dynamics deserve much attention. The future of Shanghai, of course, is not unwritten, but there's much to learn by studying where it has been, where it stands now, and the likely ways it could change in the decades ahead. More importantly, China's trajectory is not predetermined, in my view. It faces serious constraints due to both domestic and international factors. It also embodies some interesting contrasts, as I said earlier, but also different options. As Dr. Henry Kissinger recently noted, I quote, China is still in the midst of searching for the nature of its place in today's world, end quote. Now, how the Chinese dynamics unfold will make a big difference. The US grand strategy toward China, in my view, must be holistic, multifaceted, forward-looking, and flexible. Over to you, Amy.
I agree. And I also think that your discussion of elite politics, the chapter on elite politics and Shanghai, does a good job of illustrating your point that the situation is very dynamic and that there is a lot of just internal jockeying going on that ends up shaping or having an effect on the direction China heads as a whole. And so to me, it doesn't seem realistic to say that it's all been a one grand scheme that's been, was hatched in 1980 and is now coming to fruition. Many of us who lived in Shanghai saw the growth of the middle class and the surge in people having their own apartments and furnishing their apartments and people buying their first car and the gaojia going from being virtually empty to being super congested. You spend quite a bit of time talking about how historically around the world, the growth of middle classes, populations in societies, and the assets that they accumulate and their association with interest in property rights and rule of law help perpetuate greater political participation and, in some sense, stability in societies. But given and if we were having this talk in 2009, I would say, yeah, that makes total sense, and that's the path we're on. But given the events of the last few years, where you've seen a crackdown on public discourse and a crackdown on lawyers pursuing cases for public interest and those kinds of things, what do you see today as modalities by which China's middle class can realistically exert the kind of force that you describe in your book?
Oh, very good question, Amy. Your question is really about the political views and the behaviors of the Chinese middle class or Shanghai middle class. As we know, the prevailing view in the West, especially in Washington, here in Washington, D.C., about the political role of the Chinese middle class at the present is no longer one of hope for political progress in the country, but rather one of fear that they will they are supporting the authoritarian Chinese Communist Party, and it will be highly nationalistic or represents a strong anti-US sentiment. Now, I would like to make 4 points. Certainly, I have a reservation with that view. First, it is far too early to declare what political role the middle class will play in China's future trajectory, because the rise of China's middle class is still a relatively recent phenomenon. And what you mentioned, Noel mentioned my first book, which is published based on my 2 years ripple and wrinkle experience in China. I tried to observe the emergence of the middle class in the middle 1990s, but the book was rejected. Originally, I have the title as a Shanghai middle class, emergence of Shanghai middle class, but rejected for a reason because reviewers 7 or 8 all said there's no such thing called Shanghai middle class. The middle class related with civil society, related with democracy, related with a lot of things. I mean, but Shanghai is only a small number of corrupt official and also poor, a large number of poor people. Now, of course, that's wrong, but that was 27 or 37 years ago, 30 years ago. Certainly, now we acknowledge the middle class, the existence. So, but it's still the early phenomenon. The China's recent news and nascent middle class tends to emphasize the status quo, and it's a risk averse in political views and behaviors. But this may be only a transitory phase, I will argue, not necessarily permanent, right? Now, this is my first point. Second, in recent years, middle class protests or movements constitute the most important political challenges to authorities. Let me give you 2 examples. I have a long list of examples that I discussed in the book. One is that, remember that in 2015, there's a TV program called Under the Dome by Cai Jing, a former CCTV anchor, then become sensational. About 200 million people view that video or that TV episode. Now, this is about the environment protection and really to show, to reflect the growing middle class resentment about the government's failure to prevent air pollution. So that's become a movement, and the change then put the environment protection into the top agenda of the leadership. Now, the other one is more recent. The nationwide public mourning in response to the tragic death of Dr. Li Wenliang. Now, we probably are very familiar with his name, the whistleblower who exposed the COVID-19 virus at the outset of the 2020 outbreak. Was particularly that his story, certainly it's a sad story, but it's also very revealing. The wave of widespread grieving reflects the public's outrage at the Dr. Li's mistreatment by local authorities or by authorities. Now, it later led to the governments to change their verdict and name him as a hero. So this is a fascinating story. Now, the both cases self-identified middle class protests or critics succeeded in persuading authority to change course or acknowledge their mistakes. So that's part of political participation. Now, number 3, my book rejects the notion that the Chinese middle class lacks shared core values because of their own diversity. I argue the members of the Chinese middle class are unified in their appreciation in the middle class lifestyle, the protection of private property rights, you just mentioned, and the developments of the market economy at home and the economic integration abroad. Policy emphasis on primary education, environment protection, food and medicine safety, and the social stability. These are shared values or the core middle class values, maybe across the nations. And finally, my last point, China's middle class views of the United States are neither fixed nor homogeneous. Their recent and ongoing disappointment with the United States seems especially acute because some politicians in Washington consider China to be a whole society threat. Remember that term? I mean, it's not just the Chinese government, state-to-state threat, but it's a whole society threat. Some racially charged statements about China have certainly caused tremendous criticism or outrage among the Chinese citizens. Now, all these new developments have generated a more nationalistic sentiment from the middle class for understandable reason, and also greater support from them for the Chinese leadership. Now, but we should place this rising nationalistic sentiment in both domestic and foreign context. So this is my answer to your question about the political role and the behaviors. I think it's still ongoing, and the final say it's far too early to give a kind of definitive answer to that question. I think our political leaders sometimes rush to a conclusion without seeing that the complicities and also the action-reaction process. If you put yourself in the Chinese middle class shoes, do you think they will continue to be the great fan of American democracy? Maybe some will continue, but some, just like we, I wanted to review our democracy, or problem of our democracy. If we can do that, why not the Chinese?
And I think your answer just now is a good lead into what we'll talk about when we look at your recommendations for the future, because your analysis about not imposing a monolithic view of China becomes very important to your analysis of the future. On the political front, you make the assertion that something new is afoot in Chinese elite politics, largely due to the political dynamism from Shanghai. So that too is a pretty radical assertion in a time when everybody seems to be obsessed with Beijing princeling politics. So what have you seen, or what are you seeing that caused you to form this conclusion?
Well, Amy, first, let me make it clear that the Shanghai leaders have never been identical among themselves. Now, in PRC history, there have been some leftist or Maoist radicals, such as the famous Gang of Four, or all of them come from Shanghai. There have also been more moderate and well-known reform leaders, such as former Mayor Zhu Rongji, later become Premier of China, and also former Mayor Xu Kuangdi. Now, having said that, I do believe that the leaders of Shanghai origin, or those who have spent much of their careers in Shanghai, have some distinct features from having run the most cosmopolitan city in the country. Now, it is interesting to point out that after the Tiananmen incident, Deng Xiaoping surprised almost everyone by designating a Shanghai leader, Jiang Zemin, to be his successor. In 1990, a year later, Deng Xiaoping said, I quote, "One of the mistakes that I made, a big mistake I made, is that I did not include Shanghai when I launched the 4 special economic zones in 1980. This is what Deng Xiaoping said. Now, the same year, China launched its historical plan for developing Pudong. Now, it is also interesting to note that Xi Jinping has been surrounded by a few Shanghai leaders in his inner circle or in the top leadership, including Wang Funing, has a nickname as China's Henry Kissinger. His book now, America Against America, has become very popular. And also Han Zhen and Yang Jieci, the chief diplomat, and Ding Xuexiang, a very important figure running Xi Jinping's office, and Li Qiang, the current party secretary of Shanghai, Li Xi, now the Guangdong party chief, also worked many years in Shanghai, and Xu Qiliang and Yang Jiaodu, and etc. All of them whom serve in the current 25 members Power Bureau, and 2 of them are in the Power Bureau Standing Committee. Some will be further promoted next year at the 20th Party Congress. Now, is it important? My answer is yes. During the Taiwan Strait crisis in 2000, I just want to use the example. In contrast to many hawkish Chinese leaders, officials in Shanghai reportedly lobbied against the military hardliners. And Mayor Xu Kuangdi made significant efforts to reassume Taiwanese business people. There are a lot of them then, and still some of them still in Shanghai. So Xu Kuangdi make them, you're safe, please stay in, continue to work in the city. Now, similarly, President Jiang Zemin, former President Jiang Zemin, has been criticized or has been recognized by many analysts, both in China and abroad, for implementing, actually this is praised by many, implementing a moderate approach to a crisis such as Taiwan's presidential election in 1996, Belgrade embassy bombing in 1999, and also EP3 airplane incident crash in 2001. Now also Premier Zhu Rongji, a Shanghai leader, also strongly and skillfully pushed for negotiating, leading to China's accession to the WTO in 2001. Now these kind of soft actions or reactions were criticized by many Chinese at the time, but they are now widely regarded by the public as wise policies. So maybe I'm exaggerating, make a kind of generalization, but I do see the different approaches and related with the experience and the cosmopolitan nature of the city. And of course, there's some exception, but I think the norm is that the Shanghai leader usually are more thoughtful. And also President Xi Jinping also, as I said earlier, his experience in Shanghai is brief, only served as top leader for 8 months. But he promoted a lot of Shanghai leaders, and also leaders from Zhejiang are very close to Shanghai. That's actually very, very important.
So a lot of us have been watching what's been happening with the residential real property developers who are in crisis from debt. And in a way, those events give us a chance to examine some of the phenomena you describe about the middle class's distaste of corruption and the use of government elites for of rules that apply to them only and not to other people. And what do you see, given the situation and given how deeply you've examined these various tensions, how do you think this is going to play out, this debt crisis, in the coming year as we head into this major party meeting that will be a shifting of a certain guard?
It's an excellent question. But first, let me give you some statistics, which I also use in my book. Still relatively new. According to 2019 large-scale survey of China's urban residents conducted by the People's Bank of China, 96% of Chinese families in cities and towns own property. This is very big. 96% of urban China own property, their own property, among which 31% own 2 housing units and 11% had 3 properties or more. Now, this is an astonishing number, right? Now, the average value of household assets of Shanghai residents was about $1.2 million US, average Shanghai residents' property. Now, a significant portion of Shanghai families own 2 properties, and also some probably also 3. Now, this is just a sensational number, but it's published by People's Bank 2 years ago, a couple of years ago. Now, a property bubble, you can imagine, has long been a nightmare for the Chinese authorities. Oversupplies if the bubble broke, right? But on the other hand, so many people, rich people in China, wanted to have a room in Shanghai or a unit in Shanghai. So under Xi Jinping leadership, the middle class actually doubled in the country in 8 or 9 years, largely moving from Shanghai, Shenzhen, Beijing, and Guangzhou to 2nd tier and 3rd tier cities. So according Dominic Barron, now is the ambassador, Canadian ambassador to China, he was the head of the McKinsey. He wrote a report many years ago saying that in 2002, 40% of China's middle class live in these 4 cities, as just mentioned, Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Shenzhen. But now the percentage reduced from 40% to 16%. So 76% of middle class now live in 2nd and 3rd tier cities. So Xi Jinping certainly make that more effective, so reduce some of the challenges or disparity. But the property bubble is still a big challenge. Xi Jinping, Han Zheng, and Liu He, these are the top economic administrators. They constantly talk about the financial and the economic risk, the debt issue you just mentioned. And also you probably heard the big story about the Evergrande. The Evergrande, just someone said that this is China's Lehman Brothers moment. But I don't think that's the case, because that comparison is not appropriate, because most Chinese family actually pay their mortgage. And that's a different, they also have savings. This is completely different. American middle class, usually almost all buy mortgage and have mortgage, and also they need to pay property tax, right? And they do not have much saving. But China actually is not like this. But still, if there's a bubble, you can see the middle class, their assets will be really shrink. So this could be serious political risk for the political and social stability. So government need to be very, very serious. But they want to find a joint line. On one hand, they should control the property price. You see that a lot of policies over the past few years. It's nothing new to control the property development. But at the same time, should make sure not to go too low. If it's too low, the middle class will be really upset. There will be political tensions. So they wanted to join this kind of line. I think that at the moment, I'm actually think that they're doing the right thing. And also, I think it's now gradually China will adopt the property tax. Previously, there's no property tax, but now they want to adopt, but still in a relatively modest way. Most cases, they will not tax the first house, first unit, but only second unit. And also the rate is relatively low, not like United States, 1% or 2%. So that's the policy move. And certainly, I think that the property development previously related with the corruption, but I think the corruption now is with some other issues like Hainan Airlines, etc. Evergrande is less to do with corruption, but more to do with some speculators just out of control to take too much risk. But Evergrande has its own sets and assets. So now government forces them to sell these assets. So I think that it's not like someone said that this is the Lehman Brothers moment. I think that also government lay out that there's called the 3 red line policy. They gradually want to deal with this kind of problem.
Well, it's going to be interesting to see, because I remember when I was still practicing real property in China in 2011, they announced the first real property tax pilots in Chongqing and Shanghai, and here we are decades later.
Yes.
But you reference Joseph Nye as asserting that a country cannot persist without soft power. So when I was reading that, I was trying to think of what are some societies, not nation to nation, but are there societies where China today exerts soft power? And in what spheres? And if there aren't, you think there aren't, are there aspects of Chinese society that could develop soft power capability in the future? And what role would you see China's middle classes playing in that?
This is also an important question. I think far too often people in this country, and maybe also in some other Western countries, really misinterpret the soft power, in my view. They even create a term called sharp power, only refer to 2 countries. One is Russia, one is China, because anything they did, culture, education, and maybe not so ill-intended as kind of conspiracy to influence the Western countries or Western democracy. I mean, some of the policies maybe, but most of them are not. When we talk about soft power, some of them are really not ill-intended or even nothing to do with government or government-sponsored authoritarian, the evil outreach. So I remember when I was back in China, there's a kind of a spiritual pollution. Remember the 1980s? Then the people are suspicious about anything from West, like all things are ill-intended. And so it's very sad. This kind of view now, it also occurs in Western democracies. Now, so in a way, talk about soft power, I will refer to like sports, like art, architecture, music, and the films, and also Chinese food is part of soft power. So it's so popular around the world. You go to some small places, you will find a Chinese restaurant. This is also part of the culture exchanges. I do not see anything evil about that. And also education. China is catching up. China now become a country, receive a lot of foreign students. Of course, still not cannot compete with the United States, but catching up. If we look at African students, there are more African students in China than in the United States, and also sponsored by some kind of fund or grants. And also that earlier I mentioned Kung Fu, this martial art, is also part of the culture. And in terms of influence, if we go to East and Southeast Asia, including Taiwan, there's a very, very strong Chinese influence in terms of movies, TV series, music, and songs, and etc. I think that in terms of sports, remember ping pong, diplomacy is part of soft power. And also American NBA basketball played as American ambassador to China, particularly later Kobe Bryant. He is such a popular figure. My book mentioned that in February 26, 2000, the dominant news in China's social media and also Weibo, the search engine on Kobe Bryant is 2 times than COVID-19. But at that time, it was the peak time of COVID in China. So people really love Kobe Bryant. He is a culture ambassador. His influence certainly go beyond basketball court. So that's kind of soft power. Sadly, that everything becomes so suspicious. And so I think that it's not so much about, in most cases, not ill-intended. And of course, China's sports, you look at China's diving team in Olympics, you will see the Winter Olympics and etc. This is show China's growing influence in this area. I actually particularly moved by disabled people, Para Olympics in the summer. Chinese got a lot of medals in Tokyo. I think that as a country has a huge population of physically challenged people. I think that the China certainly, according to some studies, this is like a 60 million to 80 million. This is could be even more than Germany, the largest European country, that size. So again, I hope that China will do more, but that certainly China already show this kind of compassion, I think, largely by society. I think, but also sometimes the government are also aware of the challenge. So that's a good story itself.
Yes, yeah, definitely. Those are really good examples. To close out my questions before we get into other audience members' questions, I just want to ask you a few things about the future. So we've talked about the past, we talked about what's happening now. Many people are very gloomy these days about US-China relations, as we've talked about. But you argue that middle-class culture can determine the direction of change in China. And so can you tell people obviously need to read your book, which is right here. And it's got so much nuance to it, but can you just briefly talk about why you see this as being so and how it could happen given the current environment?
Well, US-China relations have deteriorated in recent years at a speed and a scope beyond what could have been predicted. This most consequential bilateral relation in the world is heading toward a dangerous state. Not only has each side accused the other of being a genocidal regime and speculated that the COVID-19 pandemic was originated from a lab leak in the other country. This is really awful. But the risk, not only this kind of accusation still without any solid ground, but also the risk for military confrontation and war between both superpowers is also on the rise. As demonization of the other grows in both countries without significant pushback, it would be naive to believe that there's any easy way to reverse or halt this troubling trend. Now, certainly there's an ongoing dialogue. There's also summit, probably virtual summit later this month or early, or sometimes by the end of this year. But these dialogues on climate change and the calls for cooperation between Washington and Beijing regarding like the Taliban control Afghanistan are welcome development. But the strong zero-sum game, zero-sum views of the bilateral relationship will significantly undermine these efforts. So in this deteriorating environment, I argue that it has become even more critical to search for a new driving force for US-China engagement. Now, but it requires the mindset change. It's not driven by fear in the bilateral relationship, but by hope, not to demonize others, but the recognition of the common aspiration and the shared interest. So in that way, I think that the middle class development actually is a shared objective by both countries' leaders. Look at Biden, President Biden. He talked about foreign policy for middle class. Actually, his emphasis on domestic policies. But even his predecessor, Donald Trump, many people, many of us do not like him. But we should not forget his tax cut, his slogan to make America great again is also focused on middle class. But of course, Chinese leaders talk a lot about the middle class expansion and the common prosperity, Chinese dream, right? So I think this shared aspiration could be the foundation of both countries, not to demonize others, but have empathy and find a room to, it's not so much for the Wall Street, but for Main Street in the United States. Because globalization, we should understand that the benefit greatly for China, but not so much for United States. I'm not saying that Chinese are eating our lunch, but the result is that the American middle class is shrinking. So for that reason, Chinese should be sensitive. I think we should really be win-win, this kind of attitude. Now, also that a Singaporean scholar mentioned, when China had the early decades of the, probably even now, they do not see American wealth as a challenge or threat. This is the opportunity. I think it's the same mindset could also feel Americans. We should not see that China's rise of middle class is a threat, but it could be also opportunity for market, for consumption, for many other things. There's no limits that only, I think that this is related with zero-sum mindset. So I think we should change that mindset. We should emphasize similarities, common aspiration, mutual interest, rather than demonize each other without empathy, without sympathy. I think this is the thing. But I do not know whether it can succeed or not. But this is my humble way to try to show things could be different. Because what's the alternative? Alternative is really the competition leads to the confrontation. It's very dangerous. So over to you.
Well, I'm just gonna ask one last question, which is, given the situation you see, and given the tendency towards demonization, are there things that people who are here today who care about both China and the United States can do in the way we talk, or the way we express ourselves, or the way we engage to help diffuse some of the tension that you so eloquently describe?
Well, I'm glad you end our conversation with this profoundly important question. I think far too often we see US-China relations as a state-to-state relations, and forget it is also people-to-people relations. So at the time that the United States caught in the domestic divides, I think Republicans and Democrats, they probably in the Congress, they disagree everything except China, to be harsh on China. So we should not expect too much things will change. Biden could not change, even if we want to change. So we should rely on the strong ties between people to people, like your society, like your organization, like the local level. And also local level should play very, very important role for cooperation, whether it be educational, culture exchanges, and also local, also have a lot of sister cities, state to state, city to city, and also local, major, actually, there's a survey, there's a statistic I just read somewhere. Last year, the 15 states have China as the largest trade partner. But these are major states, California, Florida, New York, and also important states like Pennsylvania, Virginia, and etc. So that tells us that the things could be different. The local level could be different kind of consensus. So I think have like strong ties. It's very, very important. I believe that if the United States and China can avoid so-called Thucydides trap or hegemonic confrontation, this really will be disaster, not only for these two countries, but also for the world. It will be because 40 years cooperation, exchanges, engagement, and provide multi-levels, kind of contact in numerous ways at the different levels. I think that should prevail. That should be the foundation to save our two countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Cheng. Nora, did you want to, are there some questions from the audience that you wanted to put out?
Yeah, we've had some questions come in the chat box. So let's look at some of these. One is talking about the middle class and their investments and saying, the questioner says, don't you think the middle class wants to take their investments abroad? And perhaps this was the real reason that cryptocurrency was banned, for fear of capital flights. So I guess the question is, what do you think about that? And then he goes on to say, you think the USA should welcome Chinese tech sector firms to invest more in the US, like semiconductors, since Taiwan is a flashpoint. So do you think Chinese companies would invest in the US in the tech sector?
Well, both are excellent questions. But I think there are many reasons for this e-currency or etc. It's still debatable whether that's the motivation. The person to ask that question, it's exactly that. But the point is that of course Chinese want to invest. The rich Chinese, middle class Chinese want to diversify their investment. But at the moment, where the money should go? If you are one of them to put the money in the United States, come on. I mean, it's very dangerous. Even US, I mean, and the final year of the Trump administration, there is a ban, later become restriction. Any people, Chinese Communist Party members, their immediate family, cannot come to the United States. Of course, this is not fully implemented, but that was the plan. 300 million people. How could we know that the Communist Party members, their families? So basically it becomes so suspicious. Excuse me. So that previously there are a lot of money invested in the United States. Chinese people admire American society, American people. Early on, also American democracy. This is shining city on the hill. It's not that we talk about that, Chinese talk about that. But when you look at the current situation, deaths caused by guns and violence and the crime against the Asian Americans and many other things, and out of control for COVID-19. So people have second thought. But Europe is not always a good place to invest. So where the money go? So I think that people are struggling to look at that kind of things. Now for your second question, I think that's tough because US competition will last for a long time because it never happened before since World War II. United States confront a rivalry or competitor is equally powerful in so many ways. And in AI, 5G, China is already ahead of the United States. Huawei's the 5G stations dominated the world, 70%, 80%, even more. Now, certainly in the chips business, United States is still way ahead of China, 5 to 10 years. So that's why we want to protect. It's fair to say that the Chinese benefit from the openness of the American economy and the generosity of American university. So therefore, some people think that we cannot continue, but they do not understand the nature of technological development. You cannot control, it should be universal. But at the same time, there's a legitimate national interest and intellectual property rights. So all these things mixed together. My colleague developed a concept called selective decoupling, or so-called small yard but high walls, which is you should not abuse the national security to discriminate companies from China. But at the same time, for selective companies with national defense or with really undermine American vital interest, technological age, we need to be careful. I think probably Chinese are doing even more in that regard. So this is a way to answer your question. I think this area will be very, very difficult. And this is the core competition. And also that our political leaders, including our Commerce Secretary, mentioned to European countries, you should follow with the United States to contain China's ever-growing power. So that's I was surprised by this kind of so outspoken, blunt language, but that tells you the mood in Washington, right? So it's not easy to change that mindset. I'm not thinking I'm favoring that. Certainly, I oppose the arrest of Meng Wanzhou and also hostage of the 2 Canadians. Unfortunately, that issue is resolved, but the technological stiff competition, the term that President Biden used, will remain for the foreseeable future.
Now, would you make a few comments about what's happening in the tech sector in China?
I mean, technology, right?
Yeah, well, more what's going on with Alibaba and Tencent and what the government's trying to do with the tech sector.
Well, first of all, you heard the story of Alibaba, Tencent, Didi, and etc. The number of issues. One is probably most important is related with data location, data safety, national security. This should not be a secret. This is for everyone. I mean, United States are also concerned because it's tremendous data you can find, right? I mean, I do not want to go detail. So that's the concern. Secondly, it's a monopoly. The technology company becomes so rich, partly because of monopoly. Now, there's a kind of a sentiment that you really hate rich people. You know, I read somewhere when Jeff Bezos, the Amazon, he had the space trip, and the 50,000 Americans signed a petition asking him to not come back to the Earth. I mean, this similar view, similar sentiment also exists in China. There's a very nasty languages about Jack Ma, about others. So the second issue is the monopoly. The third one is a political challenge because the private entrepreneurs, some of them become very, very powerful. You look at the Didi, and they even wanted to IPO a day before the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. They think they can get away. So you can see from the Chinese leadership perspective, they will tell who the boss should be, right? So they crack down. It's still in the middle stage, but does not necessarily mean that Chinese want to dismantle these companies. No, because these are good companies. Didi, Tencent, Meituan is a social welfare. They did not pay the social welfare for workers. This is no under the new approach for common prosperity, for social economic stability, and to reduce the economic disparity. These are all right policies, but they may implement at the same time, maybe too rushed, and maybe not fully explained. But my point is that the period that some people can have quick money, fast money, and that chance reduce, maybe except the financial sector, but also Chinese now also tightening financial sector as well, right? So it's a new reality, but again, these companies will come back, and it's also China's vital interest to help these companies to serve China's own, competitiveness. So, but you need to resolve some of the problems. And also, it is understandable Chinese government also want to warn its own companies, private or state, when you invest in the United States, when you release all the information, you should also get our approval. You should be also aware you enter a very dangerous zone at the moment. So these are all understandable. Now, we may or may not agree with that approach. Of course, if you lost a huge amount of money, if you are the educational stocks, I mean, whole thing is like it's gone. You will be unhappy. You will be very critical, right? And but at the same time, Xi Jinping's approach may be very popular among the Chinese public. So we should put in that perspective. But those people complain are usually dominant. They're intellectuals. They're some of the people, middle class. So we should put in the context to see that dynamic. And so this is my answer to the tech company. Now, one important thing is that 5 years ago, I asked some of the top entrepreneurs. I don't want to give their names. These are people we already mentioned. I know them actually in person. Ask them the innovation in China. They themselves are cynical. But according to Li Kai-fu, my good friend of mine, former president of Google, he said that previously China completely outcopied United States or West. Then it's kind of China started to create something their own. But now it's a leap to some things that actually US want to learn from China, like a Pinduoduo, like a TikTok. So this is a profound change. Now, of course, I used the term early on, equally powerful. Each country has strengths and weaknesses. China has a good strategy in terms of the national strategy to promote, but China's political control is always a liability for technological development. But the US actually is not so strong in terms of government support and the strategic development. So far, we still do not have a really sound strategy. But we have the open society, relatively speaking, right? So it's really, there's strengths and the weaknesses of both. So I think we should not be too much fear about that. And we should not underestimate the challenge, but should not also just say everything China is ahead of us. No, it's not like that. Same things with China. If we are too arrogant, you're making a mistake. If you are too think that US just treats China unfairly without a kind of empathy to see how US look at China's technological challenge, I think this also will not work. Over to you.
Sure, I was going to say those of us that lived in Shanghai and other parts of China saw things like mobile payments, other things where China just moved right ahead, way past the US.
Yeah, it's already surpassed. So it's in terms of e-commerce, early on certainly learned from the US, but after a few years. So you can see how quickly these companies adapt to a new environment.
Yep. Yes, absolutely. Okay, well, we're coming up on time. I don't know, maybe a question that isn't easy to answer in a short time, but one gentleman said was very intrigued to hear about the Chinese Communist Party has had some strong cosmopolitan thinkers, and most of them were from Shanghai. So he's kind of says he'd like to learn a little bit more about Shanghai's role in developing this cosmopolitan view in China's political leadership.
A lot of them study in the West, and including some of the people in the Power Bureau, and some of the rising stars. And also Wang Funing spent a year where he wrote when he wrote the book American Against America. It's really talk about two Americas. So now, I mean, this book is published 30 years ago, right? And I'm not saying that he is a cosmopolitan thinker. Some others are, but he certainly did his homework. I mean, you can see it's not completed ideologue or what we perceive. And some people like Liu He study at Harvard, really learn a great deal about the American economy, and a very liberal leader. Even some of hardliners in the US, like Steve Bannon said, he's a great leader. Can talk about that. Steve Bannon did not show that much respect for any leader, US or foreign or whatever, but he said Liu He is a very impressive leader. Now he speaks good English, he's a good listener, but he is on the driver's seat for China's economic reform. I think he's very market oriented. It's really the best leader, in my view, to present China's interests and to understand the foreign perspective. Well, I can give you more examples. Most of them probably not like in the high level, but they are the bureau level and etc. So I think the 40 years education exchanges will produce a lot of Chinese elites. And but we forget this is a great achievement itself. Now, in virtually all areas, Amy, that you are in the law area. I don't know whether you read that my chapter about the lawyers in China, the partners in Shanghai. I mean, the list of the senior partners of a Shanghai private law firm, 60% of them got past the New York bar exam. They returned to China. These are returnees. If there's no hope, they will not return to China. If there's no, at least the economic laws, what's the point you go back to China to do these kind of things? So it's not complete. I'm not saying that China is rule of law country. I still think China is far away to go in terms of legal development. But there's some positive signs. The fact there's so many lawyers. When I was in China, before I came to the United States in 1985, the whole country only had 3,000 lawyers, so-called lawyers. They are all government officials. But now lawyers no longer government officials in theory. Of course, some of them could serve in the government, but some of them not. Some of them become dissidents. And most often, these people, who passed the New York law, went to Columbia and Duke and Harvard. And actually, there's one table to show that their background. It's just astonishing. I mean, to see this kind of presence. So that gives you some of kind of hope. As time goes on, China will respect more on intellectual property rights, on norms and the practice of international community, international practice. Maybe I'm too naive, too optimistic. So correct me. But again, first to buy the book, particularly the avant-garde and also educational elites, including lawyers, I think it could be quite interesting for readers.
Cheng, Amy, Shindy, I think it's time to wrap up. But again, I want to thank all of you for a very interesting session. Very, what can I say? Well, we learned a lot. And I would encourage, I read the book, I would encourage those on the call to take a look at it. I mean, just some of the chapters, like we just talked about, the one about lawyers or about the educational exchange, are really fascinating. And then to see all the people in the Politburo over time that have been something like 25 to 40% of the members of the standing committee have been from Shanghai. So there's a lot of interesting facts and obviously Cheng's arguments in the book. So if you get a chance, please take a look at it. So again, it's time. Thank you again very much. And I hope everyone enjoyed tonight's session.
Thank you for having me. I hope that I did not waste your time.
Thank
No,
you
no,
all.
it was great fun.
Thank you, WCSC.
Have a good evening.
Thank you. Thanks, Amy.
My pleasure. Good night.